right. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Robert Holcomb. I serve as Dean of Language Arts and Academic Foundations here at SRJC. I also serve as co-chair of the Arts and Lectures Committee. And so I'd like to welcome you to the first lecture of the Spring 2020 Arts and Lectures program. Dr. Jürgen Kramer, today's speaker, is a tenured faculty member who teaches in the psychology department. It's part of the broader behavioral and social sciences instructional unit. His academic interests explore many areas of psychology, including non-Western belief systems, alternative forms of healing, and other areas of cultural and human diversity. Today's lecture is entitled, "How Does the Brain Make Up Its Mind? Mysteries of the Origin of Consciousness." Please welcome Dr. Jürgen Kramer. Professor.
Thank you. What happened here? Okay. Welcome. And does this sound good? Okay. Yep. Okay, good. So I want to start out with a little anecdote here. On Friday, I was driving with my friend Stanley Krippner, who is almost 88 years old. His life has been consciousness studies, so the issue that I'm talking about today has been a huge part of his life. So I told him about the lecture that I'm giving today, and we have started to have a conversation. And then he was telling me about recent developments and theories, and then he concluded by saying, "This is all way above my pay grade." So here is this very experienced consciousness researcher saying that, and I thought, oh my, I must be in trouble here. So, from our current vantage point, it seems unlikely that we will ever arrive at a true understanding of consciousness. So just to let you know that we are dealing with something that is incredibly complex and warrants many, many lectures. What you see here is one of the foundational questions when we look at consciousness. On the left, you see a cell, you see the material world, and then you see here an experience of consciousness, awareness. And the question is, how do we explain that the one is connected with the other? Or how do they connect? This is what's called the hard problem of consciousness. And the question is, suddenly matter wakes up and takes in the world? How does this work? So there are three basic models to explain that relationship between the material, our cells, our neurons, our brain, and our experience, our awareness, our consciousness. And you see them listed here. So the first one is there is a brain, lots of neurons, lots of nerves, and they work together, and somehow as they get more complex, suddenly there emerges mind or consciousness. And it's very interesting when you read the literature carefully, there's always a leap somewhere where I always go, how did they get from here to there? There's kind of a leap in something missing in the explanation. Now another model, a dualist model, is there are these two realms, these two domains. And really, one cannot be reduced to the other. Our emotional experiences, our experiences of meaning, our aesthetic experiences, they cannot be reduced to neuronal patterns, something going on in our nerves. They're really two things that should be kept separate, researched separate, and warrant different research methods. A third general approach is panpsychism, which is actually very old, meaning that consciousness is everywhere. Mind is everywhere. And this is currently experiencing a little bit of a revival where it connects with scientific research and is becoming part of scientific explanations. One particular version of this, although some of the authors that are writing about this version really do not like panpsychism, is that there is an interaction which really they call intra-action. There is this enmeshment between mind and matter, which creates the phenomena of the world and also the phenomenon of consciousness, and I'll talk more about it as I go along. Now, these different schools, they're kind of at war with each other, and for some, panpsychism has the stink of the New Age spirituality, and people are very dismissive, and many scientists feel if they even talk about panpsychism, their professional reputation is in trouble. But it's really a way of thinking about consciousness that increasingly is gathering some attention. So we're entering a world where there are a lot of paradoxes, conundrums, unanswered questions. And the good news is here at SRJC, I will actually be teaching a class on consciousness. So we'll be discussing and I'll be lecturing on all this for a whole semester that'll start next year. However, you all know what those are. Rabbit holes, right? So there are all kinds of rabbit holes when we ask the question, how does the brain make up its mind? And I've just listed a few of them here. What is experience? Do we have free will? Altered states of consciousness? What is knowledge? All these kinds of, what is the self? And some of these I will touch upon as we go along. Now, when we look around and see, well, what is consciousness? We kind of tend to look, well, what is like us, right? So are plants like us? Do plants have consciousness? Do plants have a mind? And, it may be at first simple to say no, but then you have like the Venus flytrap, right? That catches flies, or you have this network of roots where trees and mushrooms are interconnected here and regulate a carbon exchange, which suggests that there is some form of mind or consciousness at work. Now, when we look at a robot, it's probably simple for us to say, no consciousness, it's just kind of a computer. Now, when we look at these two cute droids here, the question is getting just a little bit more complicated. And if you've watched the movie Ex Machina, then you may have experienced some fear about the droids really coming alive and looking very human-like. Now, all research and all development currently indicates that this is very, very far in the future, if at all possible. Talking about consciousness, talking about the mind, is difficult because we use words that have a lot of associations. Like when we say mind, most of us will immediately think of human mind, right? Human consciousness. When we think of the self, we will likely think about something that is well boundaried, that is sort of in here, and that I'm in charge of, right? And also, we assume that the brain actually sort of operates in very predictable patterns, ultimately based in classical physics. Those are kind of assumptions that come with these words. Now let's go a little bit back in history. And I'm going to very quickly show you a few slides here. And what they illustrate is that starting thousands of years ago, human beings had an understanding of being enmeshed with the world around them. And not just enmeshed, but also observing the world very carefully. Here we have Newgrange, where at winter solstice, the sun enters here, as you can see on this photo, to hit at the very end, like here in the middle of this hill, the altar, right? So there is an understanding of their embeddedness in the cosmos, and there's also very careful observation. Here you have other images. There are both cosmological that relate to a particular star constellation, but also a particular ecological understanding where the human beings are returning the eye of a reindeer that they have slaughtered to honor the earth and to say thank you for the food. Here's something similar, just with fish. Now, this is a picture from Casa Rinconada in Chaco Canyon, where you see all these little niches there, and there are lots of alignments, right? So, in this archaeological site, there is an understanding of human consciousness being embedded in the world and in the cosmos. And what you see here in these Australian Aboriginal paintings is really sort of showing that embeddedness in a beautiful and kind of visceral way. So that's an ancient view. Now, that ancient view had also practical consequences. What has happened is that this boy here, this young man that you see here, he went out to rescue sheep. He actually passed out. He had a vision or a dream, and he got hypothermia, and he is not back. So, given this indigenous worldview, they call the local shaman, who is a woman here, and she comes to help him. Now, what you see here happening with consciousness, which for native peoples all over the world is not extraordinary or unusual, is she enters the world. In their understanding, it is that part of this person, part of the soul, has been left behind. And her job is to gather that soul. So she goes into an altered state to find him. And his soul, which is, obviously here's shown as part of his body, in his body, she calls that soul back. Now, Mongolian shamans who have watched this movie have said that this is a very accurate depiction of what happens in their world. So she starts to travel. She goes into an altered state, she starts to travel, and she uses her spirit animals, and she makes the sound of the spirit animals to call upon him. So this is not only a different worldview, a different understanding of how we are embedded in the world, but also using that worldview pragmatically to help others. So it's not just there's a different story, a different imagination, or maybe a different fantasy or misguided fantasy, but it's something that is applied. And here you see how the shaman is, she's the hawk, calling back the soul of this young man. So she does her invocations, she sings, she chants to call him back. So this is what's happening in the dream reality, in some altered state reality. And this is what's happening in the yurt, where she's doing this ceremony, where she just drummed and chanted and went into a trance. And this hiccup is very common to people who've gone into that kind of trance at the end. And what we see, the movie depicting here, is that she was able to bring the young man back, to call his spirit back. So that obviously is a very different understanding of consciousness than we generally have, right? When we talk about human consciousness, the self and all of that, we think of it as being in our bodies, connected with the boundaries that we have. So we have innumerable assumptions about consciousness. One is that we need to have a self to have consciousness. Do we need to have a self to have consciousness? When something behaves like us, then we intuit that that being probably has consciousness too, right? Because it sort of behaves like we are. The problem is, of course, as we've seen numerous times in the history of science, that scientific insights can be very counterintuitive, right? And our intuitions may not be true. So often when consciousness and the brain are concerned, computer metaphors are used. I once heard Roland Fisher from Johns Hopkins talk about consciousness, and he says, well, let's ditch the computer. What about ants and an ant society and an anthill as a metaphor for consciousness? Here's another suggestion, right? It is better to think of the brain as an ocean rather than an information system. In place of engineering-inspired architectures of inputs and outputs, short-term and long-term memory storage, and representational encoding, the ocean brain presents an encounter with chaotic forces. Okay. Now, the central assumption of how we do science to this day, that is the most common assumption, is that out there is an independent reality, a real world, as it were, and that it looks like what we see with our senses, and that our research works like a mirror. Our research represents what is out there. So we have simulations that are reasonably accurate, reflecting that reality. So the observer and the observed are distinct, separate realities, okay? And binaries are very important. There's the observer and the observed, there's inside, outside, the self and what is not the self. So these are all assumptions that guide how we look at the world. With that, we also assume that there are things out there, ontology, things that are, we can discover, and that independent of that, we have an epistemology, a way of knowing, and that our way of knowing is independent of the beings because they're separate, right? They're independent entities. And that those ways of knowing, those epistemologies, will allow us to mirror, reflect what's out there. And a third issue, which always comes up in research, is, of course, ethics. How do we do this well? And the rabbit here has an important footnote for us. Okay, then things got messy. Quantum theory arrived. The sad news is that quantum theory arrived about 100 years ago for all practical purposes, but that it actually has had a remarkably small impact on the field of psychology in general. And when we deal with quantum theory, it sort of upsets all the assumptions that I have talked about. And why does all this matter? Because our praxis, what we do, how we engage in the world, how we apply things, follows from what we assume about reality and what our research finds. So this matters, and I will talk about this more as we go along. Of course, all this is really troubling because there are many quantum interpretations. There are, some of you may have heard of the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum theory. There are actually multiple Copenhagen interpretations, and on. So one of the efforts, which I appreciate, is to move from an anthropocentric worldview to what's called a post-humanist worldview, meaning not having the human being at the center of our understanding, at the center of everything. Now that's a gigantic switch. And about 20 years ago, I actually wrote an article entitled Millennial Twins. It was an essay, and I put in photos of pine trees, and I sort of tried to make the pine trees part of the conversation. So that was sort of one way to deal with this. The thing about quantum theory is that it arguably applies at all levels, not just at the micro level, but also at the macro levels, not just small objects, but all the way. There is one set of laws coming out of quantum field theory that applies to everything, where the Newtonian classical physics are a special case, so to speak. Now, why is quantum theory important? In quantum theory, what quantum theory discovered is that a light wave can be both a particle and light can be both a particle and a wave. And which one it is depends on your research method. It depends on how you look at it. If you look at it one way, you'll see a particle. If you look at it another way, you will see waves, right? Now, this is something where we would say, well, that shouldn't be the case, right? That makes things very difficult if one thing can be two things at the same time. So that's called complementarity, right? And you can already see where I'm going, right? Brain, mind, brain, consciousness, right? Complementarity. So light behaves quantum mechanically, as Feynman said. So all of this means there is no independent reality, because what appears depends on my intervention, depends on my research method, right? Depending on what I do, something different shows up, right? Now, that's a big deal. And it's such a big deal that many psychologists certainly don't like to deal with it, because it makes everything complicated. Our research methodology is at times called the cut. What? You make a cut in reality and you say, here, this is what I'm looking at. And then you see certain things. The bottom line is that we are dealing with probabilities rather than certainty. In a Newtonian classical physics universe, you do ABC and certain things will inevitably follow. However, in quantum theory, we have probabilities, and binaries are breaking down. Self, non-self, that distinction is not so clear anymore, right? So there's the term entanglement. So things get very complicated. So you can look at yourself as a complex array or matrix of quantum equations with various probabilities moving around in the world. There is actually a psychologist by the name of Robert Hull who tried to do this without quantum theory many years ago and sort of describe the way we function in equations. Let me make a few distinctions here. Cognition. Cognition is a broader term than thinking. Okay. Thinking I associate with higher consciousness, right? And I'll define cognition more in a second. And technical systems can also be cognitive, right? Your whatever, if you have the current iPhone, it recognizes your face and makes a decision that it's okay to open up the phone, right? There's a cognition there. It does something as a consequence, right? So cognition is a process that interprets information within contexts that connect it with meaning, right? That's what cognition is. And you see here, the word human is not in there, right? So that opens up the possibility also of non-human cognition. So cognition has to do with choice, and I'm not going to go over these in detail. But there are different modes of engagement with the world. There are material processes, right? Avalanche, right? Coming down the hill, rocks, snow. That's a material process that, there is no consciousness that we know of at work, although even that can be questioned when we say that the material mind and matter are enmeshed right from the start. Now, a lot of what we human beings do, we do under the radar without ever knowing that we're doing it. That's called non-conscious cognition. Your brain, your nervous system, does innumerable things that actually prop up your consciousness, right? That you are not aware of. And non-conscious cognition means, on principle, you cannot be aware of it, however hard you try. That doesn't mean you can't impact it, but you can't be aware of the process itself. Your cerebellum is responsible for smooth movement, for example, right? It's actually where the highest number of neurons are in the brain, the highest mass of neurons, right? That works perfectly, but you cannot follow the process of how your cerebellum cognizes, right? No way. You cannot make this conscious. Now then, we have modes of awareness that are conscious. That's pretty straightforward. But then there's also our unconscious. Those are the things that, with some work, with some labor, we can make conscious, right? It may not be easy. We may have a dream. We have to interpret the dream to understand what the dream maybe is trying to tell us. So non-conscious cognition, on principle, we cannot be conscious of. And then subconscious or unconscious, with some work, we can. Okay. I think I've said all this. So the important part about non-conscious cognition is there's already an interpretation that your brain makes without you being aware of it. It's a filter that actually helps you not being overwhelmed by what is happening in the world. If you take a powerful hallucinogenic, very often these filters get sort of moved away, and you can have the experience of, being overwhelmed by experiences. That would be a metaphor for that. Okay? But there are these interpretations that happen before anything arrives in your consciousness. But it's part of you making sense of the world. So most human cognition happens outside of our consciousness. Now, there's now sufficient evidence, and Michael Pollan wrote a book about it, that there is actually cognition that goes down, say, to the plants, right? We now have enough research evidence to say that with reasonable confidence. We have technical devices, and we delegate certain types of cognition to them. If you drive your car in LA on the Santa Monica freeway during rush hour, the way you may be guided is actually determined by a very elaborate computer system that watches the flow of traffic and times traffic lights, et cetera, in accordance with that. So there is a cognition that's happening that is non-human, that is technical, and that's non-conscious. Now, clearly our environment in which we use our cognition is changing dramatically, right? I mean, here so many people now have smartphones. Is the smartphone a part of you, right? Many people sleep with their smartphone right by their bedside, right? So understanding consciousness and cognition seems increasingly important. When we talk about higher consciousness, we talk about our autobiographical self, our self-awareness, self-reflexivity, symbolic reasoning, all these things that go beyond our primary consciousness that we find very clearly in many species all around. Now, the important part about the higher consciousness is that higher consciousness creates a model of a self. Right? If I were to ask you to draw yourself the way you see yourself and come up with a drawing, maybe with some descriptions, you could give me a model of yourself that has emerged from, basic sensory experience through the non-conscious cognition into your higher awareness. When you look at this very carefully, and you see kind of the theater in the background here, right? Here's your conscious experience. And there's all this other stuff that's happening at the same time, right? There are your senses, your inner senses, your ideas, your memory systems, right, against which you compare. Many things that you do on automatic, right? And then there's your conscious experience, which really, in the scheme of things, is a very small part of what is going on, okay? Based on research, personal experience of meditators, people who've explored this, it's become increasingly clear that the self is really an illusion. The self is like a map. Like you get a map of, whatever, Arizona, and you find your way around Arizona. Yourself is a map, it's a model of the processes that you are aware of, as a center of, that culminate in your sense of self-awareness. So it's a construct to understand your mental life. The interesting thing is when people take certain hallucinogens, and Michael Pollan actually describes this in his latest book, where he lost his sense of self and just had awareness. And he said it was one of the most frightening experiences in his life. Because we are so used to having a self, right? And to imagine ourselves being in the world and experiencing without a sense of self is really difficult. And he had that experience firsthand. Now, where does the self come from? One of the processes that's very important is what's called the default mode network, for which rest is good, right? When we sit by the beach and watch a wave crashing on the beach, the surf, right? That's very critical for the development of a sense of self. So when the default network goes offline, and you see it here in red, then our self goes offline, right? All right, so the self is a conceptual model. It's not an essence, it's not a thing that you carry around inside of yourself. And of course, we are currently stuck with a Model T Ford, where we believe we have this bounded, masterful, very clear, distinct sense of self, where we're separate from the rest. And I picked this image of an interaction. You see that those two people actually aren't touching, right? Interaction, two things coming together but not actually meeting. All right, let's delve a little bit deeper and start deep down in our bodies. So here you have this image of a cell, and then you have a schematic representation of the cell. And what I want you to pay attention to are the microtubules, which are here. And my friend and colleague, Carlo Ventura, he did a lot of research, particularly around stem cells, of what's happening inside the cell and what's happening with the microtubules. It turns out that actually they have RAM. They have 500 bits of RAM. So there is memory and there is action. And let me show you this. Okay, so here, you have an obstacle, and you see this cell moving around the obstacle. And here you see a cell, changing direction to avoid an obstacle. So cognition, as I told you earlier, is a process that interprets information within context that connected with meaning. So arguably, that's what the cell does, right? This is going to be painful. This is an obstacle. I better, surround it. So I have to do something. There's an interpretation of something that has meaning and that changes the action. Here you have various actually synchronized microtubules. And the way to understand it is what's happening in the cell is actually very much like a ballet or a very well choreographed dance, where the microtubules are all responding to each other and coordinate and synchronize. And it's really only nanochemistry and quantum physics that can possibly explain that. Now, what is it like to have the mind of a cell? Can we even imagine that, right? And it's difficult, right? And can we overcome our anthropocentric bias? Can we imagine cell mind not as human consciousness? And, we can even go a little further here at the bottom. We know consciousness, right? Because that's kind of the only thing we know. We have consciousness, right? We live with consciousness every day. But we don't know what it's like to be a railing or a table or a chair, right? We don't know that from the inside. We only know that from the outside. So here you have a depiction that is actually pretty good of an experience of an altered state of consciousness using, I think, psilocybe. You see a mushroom here. And it's from the movie Altered States. And you see different aspects and qualities of consciousness surfacing in this. There are memories. There's a reptile. You can think of the reptilian brain, instinctual basis of our behavior. And clearly, he is overwhelmed by the experience, but because his usual sense of self is no longer functional, and the world starts to impinge on him as the usual filter is removed. So here's a memory of a ritual that's happening. Before, you saw memories and visions of his relationship there again, and and there is a speed in here that is typical for those kinds of alterations in consciousness. And you can see that the experience is very visual, but it's also very somatic, right? You know, feeling choked, not being coordinated here. You know, clearly visions that go into the cosmic, that relate him to the universe. And now there is an encounter with both the erotic but also life and death. So when people go through these experiences, and traditionally those were heavily ceremonially regulated experiences, there would be a way to interpret, to harvest these experiences and to connect them with meaning. So this was not just a fireworks of neurons firing, but also something that can lead to insight and changes in one's life. And that's how traditionally those rituals were and are conducted, which was one of the major flaws of the 60s, that people in the 60s didn't have an understanding of the ceremonial or ritual container that is necessary to make these experiences beneficial. So what we have here is an experience where different parts of the brain get synchronized. Older and younger parts of the brain talk to each other and communicate with each other, provide images, insights, sensations, feelings, and allow potentially for an integration. So I actually prefer the term integrative states of consciousness rather than altered states of consciousness, because there's the potential that these different parts, the older and the younger parts of the brain communicate with each other. There is a synchronization that's possible between the hemispheres, and there is a synchronization that allows, especially from our emotional brain, between our emotional brain and our neomammalian brain, our neocortex, our frontal lobes. And that's what happens in shamanic rituals. So let me try to wrap it up in the last 15 minutes here. You've all heard about the Copernican revolution, where our worldview shifted tremendously from being geocentric to being heliocentric, and understanding that the Earth is not the center of the universe. So it seems like in our understanding of consciousness and how we look at consciousness, we need to go through a similar kind of revolution. Now, Karen Barad is one of the, in my mind, significant interpreters of quantum theory. And she says that mind and matter are always enmeshed right from the start. And you see here, this yin-yang symbol. They are enmeshed and they're in each other. And you also see that the boundaries are a little fuzzy, right? That's there on purpose. I picked that on purpose. So, consciousness, in my view, is intrinsic to everything, all forms of information processing, fundamental to matter. So, this would mean that consciousness, gravity, electromagnetism, strong and weak nuclear forces are of the same ilk, that consciousness should be added to that. Now, one of the questions that you can ask, oh, these are great theories and they're complicated, and why do I even have to mess around with them? The question is, what does it mean in your life? And Karen Barad was actually asked this question in an interview, and basically what she was saying is that her own self-experience and how she lives her life has changed in consequence to her understanding. And she describes this process here just a little bit. So, how does the brain make up its mind? So there's a complementarity, right? Wave and particle, consciousness and mind. So, depending on how we observe, we either see the brain functioning, the neuronal activity, the flashing of the neurons, or we see the consciousness happening, meaning happening, and talking about meaning. So it all depends on the cut, the research methodology, the lens that I use, right? Depending on the cut, it's either light either becomes a particle or a wave. Now, there is no emergence from the brain to the mind. Remember, that's the claim of the materialistic view. We have a brain. The brain, the neuronal pattern gets more and more complex, and voila, there is consciousness. But there is consciousness right from the start that is always and everywhere, okay? Now, the interesting thing is that this kind of dissolves our understanding of objects, right? Because, we perceive, obviously the way we perceive works for us, right? Because we make it through the day, right? I mean, that this is a railing, whether the railing actually looks this way or not doesn't matter. It helps us, right? We understand these are stairs and we make it up the stairs, right? But actually, there's no evidence that we have that the stairs actually look like this, but evolutionarily, it's useful that we see them, that we map them this way. Here's a whole other theory, which I'm not going to go into in any detail. Donald Hoffman from UC Irvine, cognitive psychologist, wrote this book that argues against reality. And the one thing that's really important in here, you see there are probability. The word probability is in here. So we're not governed by the law of physics in the classical Newtonian sense, but we are governed by the laws of quantum mechanics. Consciousness or mind is in some form present right from the start. Now, even 100 years ago, William James, who was at Harvard and is really sort of the founding father of psychology in this country, he said every brain cell has its own individual consciousness. And we can't even imagine that we can link up two brains, meaning two neuronal networks, just like, we have two hemispheres that are connected through the corpus callosum. We can imagine that. If we imagine here that's a self and this is a self, well, then that's problematic to imagine, right? But if we look at it as neuronal networks, then we can conceivably imagine that there is a melding of two networks. So here we have neuronal flickering that is happening. But when we're trying to understand how the brain makes up its mind, what we always have to remember is that there is an observer, right? And that how we observe matters. Our observation is part of the phenomenon, part of the facts that we see. Without that observation, there wouldn't be these facts. Now, when I, as an observer, as a researcher, make a decision to research something, I make a subjective decision and say, well, this is important. I want to know this, right? I ask the question. I want to dig deeper, right? So that actually creates a tremendous ethical burden on researchers, right? Because suddenly, instead of, oh, I'm just following this methodology, you're saying, oh, there's a methodology. The methodology has consequences for the practice of how we see ourselves, related, non-related, independent, individualistic, whichever way. So I have a terrible weight on me because I have this ethical obligation to ask these questions. And so what we know, how we know, and the values that go with our process of knowing, they're all together, and we can't separate them. Now I'm kind of going back to the beginning of my presentation, and there is actually an ancient understanding among Native Americans in particular that when you consider an act, you should look, what are the consequences of this act 7 generations down the road, right? But there's a corollary to that that says you also need to look 7 generations backwards. So that is an expression of this ethical obligation that comes with our knowing practices. And here you see 2 paradigms colliding terribly, right? Within the Western paradigm of classical physics, of interaction, of representation and mirroring, this technological intervention on Dakota land makes perfect sense and is perfectly justified as part of technological and economic development. From a Lakota perspective, this is an interruption of a particular practice of knowing that is akin to, entirely different than the way it's spoken, but an interruption of a worldview and a ritual practice and a connection with place and history of place that gets interrupted in this way, besides that it's polluting and all of that, right? But it's not just about the pollution, it's about a clash of 2 radically different understanding of who we are in the world and what our obligations are to the world. So here I'm going back to the beginning, and I want to just show again, point to, when you take life, you give something back. That's the understanding, right? So there's a cyclical understanding of engagement. So this was a rapid race around the block about brain and mind. And Richard Feynman, who has these wonderful quotations, says, we are not to tell nature what she's going to be, that's what we find out. Every time we take a guess at how she's got to be and go and measure, she's clever. She always has a better imagination than we have, and she finds a cleverer way to do it that we haven't thought of. So what I said today, the next time I'm going to talk about it, it's going to be a little more different. There are many things that I touched upon, topics that are raised that we could spend hours exploring and going down these various rabbit holes. But the bottom line is that consciousness is everywhere, in my view. And depending on how we engage with the world, we either find ourselves as separate human beings, which has had historically many positive consequences, right? Our technology, we love our smartphones, whatever it is, our computers, right? But it also has had consequences that are entirely problematic, right? Environmental destruction, extinction of species, climate catastrophe, et cetera, et cetera. So there are many things that are also a problem. So there is a challenge about how we look at this. And to my mind, quantum theory offers a way, bringing together the intuitions and insights that indigenous people had thousands of years ago and that they've practiced over time for hundreds and hundreds of years, and modern understandings, current understandings that come from a scientific base, to bring them together to change our understanding of who we are. Remember, when I showed the quote of Karen Barad, how has this impacted your being in the world? I think that's the challenge, and that's why I think paradigms are so terribly important. All right, we have 4 minutes for questions. I guess you all have to become Alice and go down the rabbit hole. And then when you return, you'll bring back your questions and observations, right? Well, if there are no questions, I wish you a good afternoon. Hey. Yeah, give me a second to wrap.